It was a bright, sunny Saturday morning in Meadow Hills. This was a quiet little neighborhood where everybody liked to follow the rules, or at least, that's what they all thought. The houses sat in neat rows, with green lawns and pretty flowers. Kids rode bikes, and dogs barked at squirrels. Everything seemed perfect. But something exciting was about to shake things up, and it all started with one guy and his fence. Meet Jake Carter. Jake was just a normal guy. He wasn't super rich or super fancy. He didn't live in a big mansion or drive a shiny sports car. Nope, Jake had a simple pickup truck, a rusty toolbox, and a little house with a yard. His fence, though, it was a mess. The paint was peeling off, and it looked old and tired. Jake didn't like that. He wanted his yard to look nice, just like everyone else's. So, he decided it was time to grab a paint can and fix it up. Easy, right? Well, not quite. That fence was about to flip his whole world upside down. Before we go any further, I've got a fun question for you. Tell me in the comments, what color would you paint your fence? Red? Blue? Maybe bright yellow? I want to know. Now, let's get back to Jake. If you saw him walking down the street, you'd think he was super nice. He wasn't loud or mean or wild. He waved at his neighbors when he saw them. Hey, how's it going? He'd say with a big smile. He mowed his lawn every weekend, keeping it short and neat. He even picked up trash if he saw it lying around. Jake seemed like the kind of guy who never caused trouble. The kind of guy who just fit in. But here's the thing, looks can trick you. Jake wasn't as simple as everyone thought. See, behind that friendly wave and that big smile, Jake had a little spark. A stubborn spark. He wasn't the type to back down if he thought something wasn't fair. And he wasn't the type to let silly rules stop him from doing what he wanted. Oh, and one more thing, he had a secret. A big, juicy secret that nobody in Meadow Hills knew about. Not his neighbors. Not the kids on their bikes. Not even the dogs chasing squirrels. That secret was hiding right there, waiting to pop out and surprise everyone. And it all had to do with that beat-up old fence. Meadow Hills wasn't just any neighborhood. It was the kind of place where people liked everything to be just right. The grass had to be green. The mailboxes had to match. The houses couldn't be too loud or too bright. And the rules? Oh boy, there were a lot of rules. The people who lived there had something called an HOA. That stands for Homeowners Association. It's like a club that makes sure everyone follows the same rules. They had a big book full of them rules about how tall your grass could be, what color your door could be, even what kind of flowers you could plant. Most people didn't mind. They liked things neat and tidy. But Jake? He wasn't so sure about all that. Jake had lived in Meadow Hills for a couple of years. He liked it okay. It was quiet, and the people were mostly friendly. But sometimes, he felt like the rules were a little too much. Like, why couldn't he plant a big goofy sunflower in his yard if he wanted to? Or why did his truck have to be parked just so? He didn't say anything out loud, though. He just nodded and smiled and went along with it. That's what made him so sneaky. Nobody thought Jake would ever stir up trouble. They thought he was happy following the rules like everyone else. Boy, were they wrong. That Saturday morning, Jake woke up early. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and he felt good. He looked out his window at that ugly fence. The paint was chipped, and the wood looked sad. Today's the day, he said to himself. He pulled on an old t-shirt and some jeans, grabbed his toolbox, and headed outside. His pickup truck was parked in the driveway, and he popped open the back. Inside was a shiny can of paint. Not just any paint, bright red paint. Jake grinned. He could already picture how cool his fence would look when he was done. He set the can down and grabbed a brush. The air smelled like grass and sunshine. It was the perfect day to get to work. Jake dipped the brush into the paint and started slapping it onto the fence. Red streaks covered the old wood, and it already looked better. He hummed a little song as he worked. This is gonna be awesome, he thought. He didn't care what anyone else said. This was his fence, on his yard, and he could paint it whatever color he wanted. Right? Well, not everyone was going to agree with that. Meadow Hills had those HOA rules, remember? And one of those rules said fences could only be certain colors like beige or white. Boring colors. Save colors. Red. Oh no, red was not on the list. Jake knew that. He'd seen the rule book before. But he didn't care. He thought the rule was dumb. Why should someone else tell him what color his fence could be? It wasn't hurting anybody. It was just paint. So, he kept brushing that bright red all over, making the fence look alive again. What Jake didn't know was that trouble was already watching him. Across the street, behind a fluttery curtain, a pair of sharp eyes peeked out. Those eyes belonged to Karen Phillips. Karen was the boss of the HOA. She wasn't just in the club, she ran it. She loved rules more than anything. She carried that rule book everywhere, ready to point out what people were doing wrong. If your grass was too long, Karen would know. If your mailbox was crooked, Karen would tell you. She thought she was keeping Meadow Hills perfect. But really, she just liked being in charge. Karen saw Jake painting his fence red, and her face turned as red as the paint. What does he think he's doing? She muttered. She grabbed her phone and started typing fast. She wasn't going to let this slide. Not in her neighborhood. Jake didn't see her watching. He didn't hear her grumbling. He was too busy painting and humming, lost in his own little world. But Karen? She was already planning to make his day a whole lot harder. Let's talk about Jake's neighbors for a second. They weren't all like Karen. Some were nice. There was Old Man Pete, who sat on his porch every day with a glass of lemonade. He'd wave at Jake and say, "Nice truck." There was Mrs. Lopez, who grew the best tomatoes in town and sometimes gave Jake a few. And there were the kids, riding their bikes up and down the street, laughing and shouting. Most of them didn't care about Jake's fence. They didn't even notice it. But Karen? She noticed everything. And she was about to turn this quiet Saturday into a big, loud mess. Jake kept painting, brush moving up and down, red paint dripping a little onto the grass. He stepped back to look at his work. Not bad, he said out loud. The fence was starting to look brand new. It popped against the green lawn, bright and bold. Jake liked bold. He wasn't a beige kind of guy. He wasn't a follow the rules just because kind of guy either. And that's what made him different. That's what made him dangerous, at least to someone like Karen. Here's where things get fun. Jake wasn't just painting his fence because he felt like it. Nope. He had a plan. A big, secret plan that nobody saw coming. Not Karen, not Old Man Pete, not Mrs. Lopez, not even the kids on their bikes. That red paint? It wasn't just for looks. It was a clue. A hint about something huge that was about to happen in Meadow Hills. Jake wasn't a troublemaker, not really. He was something else. Something smarter. Something sneakier. And the stuck-up folks in this perfect little neighborhood? They had no idea what was coming their way. That sunny Saturday morning started out normal. Just a guy, a fence, and a can of paint. But by the end of the story, Meadow Hills would never be the same. Jake's secret was like a bomb ticking quietly, ready to explode. And when it did, oh, it was going to be good. The kind of good that makes you cheer and laugh and say, "Wow, I didn't see that coming." But we're not there yet. We're just getting started. The paint was still wet, the day was still young, and Jake was still smiling. Trouble was on its way, and he was ready for it. So, what do you think so far? Jake's out there painting his fence red, breaking the rules, and hiding a secret. What could it be? Why's he so calm about it? Stick around, because this story's about to get wild. And don't forget to tell me in the comments, what color would you pick for your fence? Let's see who's brave enough to go bold like Jake. It was still that sunny Saturday morning in Meadow Hills, and Jake Carter was out in his yard, painting his fence bright red. The paint went on smooth, and the fence started looking fresh and new. Everything seemed peaceful, birds chirping, sun shining, Jake humming a little song. But peace wasn't going to last long. Trouble was coming, and it had a name, the HOA. The HOA stood for Homeowners Association. It was like a big bossy club that told everyone in Meadow Hills what they could and couldn't do. These people loved rules. They carried clipboards and walked around checking on houses. If your grass was too tall, they'd write it down. If your mailbox wasn't the right shape, they'd tell you to fix it. They wanted everything to look the same, neat, boring, and perfect. Most folks in the neighborhood didn't mind. They liked following the rules. But Jake? He wasn't so sure about that. Leading this rule-loving pack was Karen Phillips. Karen was the HOA president, and she acted like she owned the whole neighborhood. She was tall and skinny, with a frown stuck on her face all the time. Her hair was always pulled back tight, and her eyes were sharp, like she was looking for something to complain about. In her hands, she carried a giant rulebook. It was thicker than a dictionary, with tiny words and tons of pages. Karen loved that book. She knew every single rule by heart, and she made sure everyone else followed them too. If you broke one, watch out, Karen would come for you. That morning, Karen was on her porch, sipping coffee and watching the street like a hawk. She liked to keep an eye on things. Nothing got past her. Then, she saw Jake. There he was, standing by his fence with a can of red paint and a brush. Red paint. Karen's eyes got big. Her coffee cup froze halfway to her mouth. She couldn't believe it. Red wasn't allowed. She slammed her cup down, grabbed her rulebook, and marched across the street like she was going to war. Jake didn't see her coming at first. He was too busy painting. The red paint covered the old wood, and he smiled as he worked. Looking good, he said to himself. He dipped his brush in the can again and kept going, brushing up and down, side to side. The fence was turning bright and bold, just the way he liked it. He didn't think anyone would care. It was his fence, after all. But oh boy, he was wrong about that. Karen got closer, her shoes clicking on the sidewalk. She stopped right in front of Jake's yard, hands on her hips, and stared at him. Her frown got even deeper, like her face might crack. Then she opened her mouth and yelled, "Painting your fence red." Her voice was so loud it scared the birds out of the trees. They flew away, flapping like crazy. Jake looked up, surprised, but he didn't stop painting. He just kept brushing, nice and slow. Karen wasn't done. She flipped open her rulebook and jabbed her finger at a page. "That's against Regulation 7B, Section 12, she shouted. "Fences can only be beige or white. No red. No blue. No green. Just beige or white." She waved the book in the air like it was a magic wand. To her, those rules were everything. They kept Meadow Hills perfect. And Jake? He was breaking them right in front of her. Jake didn't say much. He just shrugged his shoulders, like it was no big deal. "It's my fence," he said calmly. His voice was quiet, but firm. He wasn't yelling back. He wasn't mad. He just kept painting, brushing that red paint on like nothing was wrong. That made Karen even angrier. She expected him to stop. She expected him to say, "Oh, sorry, I'll fix it." But Jake didn't. He didn't care about her rules. And that drove Karen nuts. "You can't do this," she snapped. Her face turned red, almost as red as the paint. She pointed at him, her fingers shaking. "You'll regret this, Carter," she said. "I'm calling the HOA cops." The HOA cops weren't real police, but they acted like it. They wore uniforms and drove around in a little car, making sure people followed the rules. If you broke one, they'd show up and tell you to stop or else. Karen loved calling them. It made her feel powerful. Jake didn't even blink. He didn't look scared or worried. He just dipped his brush in the paint can again and kept going. Swipe, swipe, swipe. The red got brighter, and his fence got prettier. He started humming a little tune, soft and happy. "La la la," he went, like he didn't have a care in the world. Karen stood there, fuming. She thought he was being a dumb rebel, just some guy who didn't know better. She had no idea what he was really up to. Jake wasn't just painting a fence. He was starting something big, and Karen was about to find out the hard way. Karen stomped back to her house, her rulebook under her arm. She was madder than mad. She grabbed her phone and dialed the HOA cops right away. "Hello? Yes, this is Karen Phillips, HOA president," she said, her voice loud and bossy. "We've got a problem. Jake Carter is painting his fence red. Red. It's against the rules. You need to come stop him now." She hung up and smirked. She thought she'd won already. In her mind, Jake was done for. The HOA cops would come, and he'd have to obey. Back in his yard, Jake kept working. The sun climbed higher, and the day got warmer. He didn't know Karen had called anyone. He didn't hear her yelling into her phone. All he cared about was his fence. The red paint shone in the light, and he liked how it looked. It wasn't beige. It wasn't white. It was his. And that's what mattered to him. He wasn't trying to make anyone mad, at least, not yet. But he wasn't going to let Karen boss him around either. The neighbors started to notice the fuss. Old Man Pete peeked over from his porch, sipping his lemonade. "What's going on?" he mumbled to himself. Mrs. Lopez stepped outside with her watering can and saw Karen storming off. She raised an eyebrow. The kids on their bikes slowed down, staring at Jake and his red fence. "Cool color," one of them yelled. Jake waved at them and grinned. He didn't mind the kids. They weren't like Karen. They didn't care about rules, they just liked fun. But Karen wasn't fun. She was trouble. And she was determined to ruin Jake's day. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, watching him like a hawk. Every time his brush moved, she got madder. "He thinks he can ignore me," she muttered. "He thinks he's smarter than the HOA? We'll see about that." She tapped her foot, waiting for the HOA cops to show up. She couldn't wait to see Jake's face when they told him to stop. She thought he'd be scared. She thought he'd give up. Oh, how wrong she was. Jake's humming got a little louder. "La la la," he sang, brushing the paint in long, smooth strokes. The fence was almost half done now. Red covered the old wood, hiding the chips and cracks. It looked alive, like it had a personality. Jake stepped back to check it out. "Nice," he said with a nod. He wasn't worried about Karen or her rules or her HOA cops. He had a plan, a secret plan, and it was all falling into place. That red paint? It wasn't just for looks. It was a sign of something bigger, something that would turn Meadow Hills upside down. Karen didn't know that, though. She thought Jake was just some guy who didn't listen. A rebel. A rule breaker. She didn't see the spark in his eyes or the sneaky smile on his face. She didn't hear the way his humming sounded like he was laughing inside. To her, he was a problem to fix. A fence to repaint beige. But Jake wasn't going to let that happen. He wasn't scared of her yelling or her rulebook or her HOA cops. He was ready for whatever she threw at him. The tension was growing. You could feel it in the air, like a storm coming. Karen stood on one side, angry and loud. Jake stood on the other, calm and quiet. The neighbors watched, unsure what would happen next. The kids whispered to each other, "Is he in trouble?" Old Man Pete sipped his lemonade and chuckled. Mrs. Lopez shook her head and watered her tomatoes. Meadow Hills was always so peaceful until now. Jake's red fence was like a spark, lighting up a fight that nobody saw coming. And that's where the real fun begins. Karen thought she had the power. She thought her rules would win. But Jake? He had something up his sleeve. Something she'd never guess. The HOA cops were on their way, and the neighborhood was buzzing. What would happen when they got there? Would Jake stop painting? Would Karen get her way? Or was something bigger about to happen, something that would make everyone's jaw drop? Stick around, because this story's just heating up. Days went by after that sunny Saturday, and things in Meadow Hills got more and more tense. It was like the air felt heavy, thicker than the red paint drying on Jake Carter's fence. Karen Phillips, the HOA president, wasn't happy with just yelling at Jake. Oh no, she went big. She didn't just call the HOA cops, she called everyone. She rang up her friends in the neighborhood, telling them all about that troublemaker Jake who dared to paint his fence red. She even sent messages to the HOA group chat, saying, "We can't let this guy break the rules." The neighbors started to peek out their windows. They pulled back curtains and squinted at Jake's house, watching him work. Some whispered to each other, "Who does he think he is?" Others shook their heads, muttering, "He's asking for trouble." One guy, a grumpy man named Tom who lived 2 houses down, leaned out his door and shouted, "Paint it beige, you weirdo." His voice echoed down the street, loud and mean. The kids on their bikes giggled when they heard it, but Jake? He didn't even look up. He just kept painting, slow and steady, like he didn't hear a thing. Jake's brush moved up and down, side to side, spreading that bright red paint over the fence. He didn't rush. He didn't stop. He acted like nobody was watching, like nobody was mad. The sun shone down, drying the paint into a shiny, bold color. Every day, he'd come out with his can and his brush, adding more red. The fence was looking awesome now, way better than the boring beige and white ones all around Meadow Hills. But to Karen and some of the neighbors, it wasn't awesome. It was a big, loud problem. Karen stood on her porch every morning, arms crossed, staring at Jake. She'd sip her coffee and frown, her eyes like lasers. "He's still painting," she'd mutter to herself. "Still breaking the rules." She couldn't stand it. That red fence was like a slap in her face. She wanted it gone, or at least painted a proper color. She kept waiting for the HOA cops to show up and fix everything. She thought they'd make Jake stop. But days passed, and they hadn't come yet. That made her madder. It made the tension grow even bigger. Then, something weird happened. One afternoon, a big delivery truck rumbled down the street. It was loud, with a deep growl that made the kids on their bikes stop and stare. The truck pulled right up to Jake's house and parked in his driveway. Jake came out, wiping paint off his hands with an old rag. The driver hopped down and handed Jake a clipboard to sign. Then, the back of the truck opened, and out came boxes, big, heavy boxes. They weren't little like paint cans. No way. These were huge, taller than the kids watching from the sidewalk. Karen saw it all from her porch. She squinted hard, trying to figure out what was going on. "What's he up to now?" she grumbled. She leaned forward, her coffee cup forgotten. The boxes didn't have any labels she could read from far away. They were just plain brown, mysterious and strange. Jake didn't say anything to the driver. He just nodded, took the boxes one by one, and carried them into his garage. He had a little grin on his face, a sly, sneaky grin that Karen didn't like one bit. The neighbors noticed too. Old Man Pete, sitting on his porch with his lemonade, tilted his head. "Huh," he said to himself. "That's a lot of boxes." Mrs. Lopez, watering her tomatoes next door, stopped and watched Jake haul the last one inside. Even Tom, the grumpy guy who yelled, peeked out his window again. "What's in those boxes?" he muttered. The kids on their bikes rode closer, whispering to each other. "Maybe it's toys," one said. "Or candy," said another. But nobody knew for sure. Not even Karen. Jake shut his garage door with a loud bang. The truck drove off, rumbling away, and everything went quiet again. But now, the neighborhood was buzzing with questions. What was Jake doing? Why did he need those big boxes? Was it more paint? Something else? Karen tapped her foot, thinking hard. She didn't trust Jake. Not one bit. "He's planning something," she said under her breath. "Something sneaky." She was right, but she had no idea how big it really was. Jake went back to painting after that. He grabbed his brush, dipped it in the red paint, and kept going like nothing had happened. Swipe, swipe, swipe. The fence was almost all red now, bright and shiny in the sun. He hummed his little tune again, la la la, soft and happy. He didn't look worried. He didn't look scared. He just kept working, slow and steady, while the neighbors whispered and Karen glared. Every brush stroke made the tension grow. Every box in that garage added to the mystery. The neighbors didn't know it yet, but Jake wasn't just painting a fence. He wasn't just breaking a rule to be annoying. No, every move he made, every dab of paint, every box he hid was part of something bigger. Something huge. Something that was going to flip this whole story upside down and make everyone's eyes pop out of their heads. Karen thought she had Jake figured out. She thought he was just a guy who didn't listen, a rebel who liked to make trouble. She was waiting for the HOA cops to come and shut him down. She pictured them telling him, "Paint it beige or else." She pictured him giving up, head down, sorry for breaking her precious rules. But Jake wasn't worried about the cops. He wasn't worried about Karen. That sly grin he had when he carried those boxes? That was a clue. A hint. He knew something they didn't. The days kept passing, and the fence kept getting redder. The neighbors kept watching, some mad, some curious. The kids started daring each other to ride past Jake's house and wave. "Hi, Jake," they'd yell, and he'd wave back, smiling. Old Man Pete started to chuckle every time he saw Karen frown. Mrs. Lopez just shrugged and went back to her tomatoes. But Karen? She was like a volcano ready to blow. She couldn't wait to see Jake get in trouble. Little did she know, Jake wasn't in trouble. He was in control. Those boxes in his garage weren't random. That red paint wasn't just for fun. Every brush stroke, every day that went by, brought him closer to something amazing. Something that would change Meadow Hills forever. The tension was thick, the questions were piling up, and Jake? He just kept painting, slow and steady, with that sneaky grin. What was he up to? You'll find out soon. This story's about to get wild. Monday morning came fast in Meadow Hills. The sun was up, the air was cool, and the neighborhood was about to get loud. Jake Carter was outside, still painting his fence red. The bright color shone in the sunlight, almost done now. He hummed his little tune, la la la, brushing the last few spots. Everything seemed normal until two guys showed up. They were the HOA cops, and they didn't look happy. These HOA cops weren't real police, but they acted tough. They wore cheap uniforms, dark blue shirts and pants that didn't fit quite right. One had a big belly, and the other was skinny with a loud voice. They carried handcuffs on their belts, clinking as they walked. They drove up in a little white car with HOA Patrol written on the side. Karen Phillips, the HOA president, had called them, and now they were here to stop Jake. Jake Carter, the skinny cop shouted, his voice sharp and mean. Step away from the fence. You're under arrest for violating HOA rules. He pointed at the red fence like it was a crime scene. The other cop, the one with the big belly, crossed his arms and nodded. They stood there, looking serious, ready to make Jake obey. The neighbors heard the shouting and ran outside. They gathered on the sidewalk, pulling out their phones to film everything. Kids on bikes stopped riding and stared. Old man Pete shuffled to his porch with his lemonade. Mrs. Lopez peeked over her tomato plants. Even Grumpy Tom came out, muttering, "About time." The crowd grew bigger, buzzing with whispers. "Is Jake in trouble?" one kid asked. "He's going to jail," another said. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Karen stood right in front, arms crossed, smirking like she'd already won. Her frown was gone, replaced by a big, smug smile. She'd waited days for this. She'd called the HOA cops, told everyone about Jake's bad fence, and now she thought it was over. Finally, she said to herself. He'll have to paint it beige now. She rocked back on her heels, happy as could be, sure that Jake was done for. But Jake? He didn't look scared. He didn't look mad. He just put down his paintbrush, nice and slow, and wiped his hands on his jeans. The red paint smeared a little, but he didn't care. He looked at the HOA cops, then at Karen, and said, "All right, let's settle this." His voice was calm, like he wasn't worried at all. The crowd got quiet. What was he going to do? Was he giving up? Everyone leaned closer, holding their breath. Jake turned and walked to his garage. The same garage where he'd hidden those big, mysterious boxes from the delivery truck. Karen squinted, confused. The HOA cops frowned, not sure what was happening. The neighbors whispered, "What's he doing?" Jake grabbed the garage door handle with both hands. He paused for a second, letting the tension build. Then, with one big pull, he yanked the door up fast and loud. Boom! It rolled open, and there it was. Inside the garage sat a giant, shiny sign. It was huge, taller than Jake, and covered in bright colors: red, yellow, blue, and green. Big, bold letters spelled out, Meadow Hills Art Festival sponsored by Jake Carter. The words sparkled in the sunlight, impossible to miss. Balloons and streamers peeked out from the boxes behind it, all ready to go. The crowd gasped, loud and shocked. Phones shook as people tried to film it. "What?" someone yelled. "No way," said a kid on a bike. Karen's jaw dropped. Her smug smile vanished, and her mouth hung open like a fish. She blinked hard, like she couldn't believe her eyes. The HOA cops froze, their tough faces turning soft and unsure. Old man Pete laughed so hard he spilled his lemonade. Mrs. Lopez clapped her hands and cheered. The kids shouted, "Cool," and "Awesome." The whole street erupted, buzzing with noise. Jake stood there, hands in his pockets, grinning. He wasn't just some guy painting his fence for fun. Nope. He was an artist, a real one. The city had secretly hired him to start a huge art festival right here in Meadow Hills. And that red fence? It wasn't breaking rules, it was the star of the show. The festival was going to bring music, food, and tons of art to the neighborhood. Jake's fence was the centerpiece, the first big splash of color to kick it all off. The best part? The HOA had no power over this. It wasn't just Jake's idea, it was a city project. That meant Karen's rulebook didn't matter. Jake stepped forward, still smiling, and looked right at Karen. "Check your rulebook, Karen," he said, his voice smooth and happy. "I think you missed page 47, public arts allowed." He tapped his head like he was saying, "Think about that." Karen's face turned red, not mad red, but embarrassed red. She fumbled with her rulebook, flipping pages fast, trying to find something to say. But Jake was right. Page 47 said the city could approve public art, and the HOA couldn't stop it. She'd missed it. All her yelling, all her complaining, and she was wrong. The crowd started to giggle. The HOA cops looked at each other, confused. Well," the skinny one mumbled. "I guess," the big-bellied one added. They didn't know what to do. Jake crossed his arms and leaned against his truck. "So," he said to the cops, "am I still under arrest?" The crowd laughed louder. The cops shook their heads, stuffed their handcuffs back on their belts, and shuffled to their car. They didn't say a word, just climbed in and drove off, tires squeaking. Karen stood there, rulebook in her hands, looking small and silly. Her big win had turned into a big flop. The neighbors didn't care about rules anymore. They rushed over to Jake, asking questions. "An art festival?" Mrs. Lopez said. "That's amazing." Old man Pete slapped his knee and said, "You got good, Jake." The kids begged to help with the balloons. Even Grumpy Tom cracked a tiny smile and muttered, "Not bad." Jake nodded and laughed. "Yep," he said. "It's gonna be fun. Stick around." The red fence wasn't trouble, it was a surprise. Jake wasn't a rebel, he was a hero. He'd tricked Karen, fooled the HOA, and brought something awesome to Meadow Hills. The tension popped like a balloon, and now everyone was excited. The big reveal was out, and it was better than anyone could have guessed. What would happen next? Oh, this story's not over yet, things are about to get even better. Monday morning in Meadow Hills was wild after Jake's big reveal. The HOA cops stood there, scratching their heads, not sure what to do. They'd come to arrest Jake for painting his fence red, but now they knew the truth. His fence wasn't against the rules, it was part of a huge city art festival. The skinny cop mumbled, Sorry, Jake." The big-bellied cop nodded and said, "Yeah, our bad." They stuffed their handcuffs back on their belts and shuffled to their little white car. The engine started with a sputter, and they drove off, leaving dust behind. They didn't look tough anymore, just silly. Karen Phillips, the HOA president, wasn't ready to give up yet. She stood in front of the crowd, her arms flapping like a bird. "Wait," she shouted, holding up her giant rulebook. "This can't be right. He broke the rules. You can't just..." But nobody listened. The neighbors were too busy cheering for Jake. They clapped and hooped, their phones out, snapping pictures of the bright red fence. "Awesome," one kid yelled. "So cool," said another. Karen's voice got lost in the noise. She waved her clipboard, but it was useless now. Nobody cared about her rules anymore. The crowd turned away from Karen and rushed toward Jake. They surrounded him, smiling and laughing. Old man Pete hobbled over with his lemonade and said, "You showed Jake." Mrs. Lopez ran up, her watering can still in her hand, and grinned. "This festival's gonna be great," she said. Even Grumpy Tom, who'd yelled at Jake before, shuffled closer and muttered, "Nice job, I guess." The kids on their bikes dropped them on the grass and begged, "Can we help? Please." Jake laughed and nodded. "Sure thing," he said. "We've got work to do." Karen watched it all, her face turning pink. She wasn't mad now, she was embarrassed. Her big plan to stop Jake had flopped. She'd called him a troublemaker, told everyone he was wrong, and now she looked foolish. She hugged her rulebook tight, like it could save her, but it couldn't. The HOA didn't rule this time, the city did. And Jake? He was the star. Karen took one last look at the cheering crowd, then turned and slunk back to her house. Her shoes clicked on the sidewalk, slow and quiet. She shut her door with a soft click, and that was it. She was done. Jake didn't waste a second. He grabbed his paintbrush again, dipped it in the red paint, and went back to work. The fence wasn't quite finished, and he wanted it perfect. Now, though, he wasn't alone. A bunch of neighbors stayed to watch, some sitting on the grass, others standing with their phones. "Looking good," Mrs. Lopez called out. Jake waved and kept painting, swipe after swipe. The red shone even brighter in the sun, and soon, the whole fence was done. He stepped back, wiped his hands, and smiled. "There," he said. "Already." Word about the art festival spread fast like wildfire. By lunchtime, Meadow Hills was buzzing. People talked about it over their sandwiches. Kids ran around, shouting, "There's gonna be balloons." Old Man Pete told his friends on the phone, "Yep, Jake's the man." Mrs. Lopez texted her family, "You've got to see this." Even Grumpy Tom told his wife, "Guess it's not so bad." The news jumped from house to house, yard to yard, until everyone knew. Jake wasn't a troublemaker, he was a hero. And his red fence? It was the coolest thing in town. The festival prep started that afternoon. Jake opened his garage again, and out came the big boxes he'd hidden. Inside were decorations, streamers, banners, and more signs. The giant shiny one that said Meadow Hills Art Festival sponsored by Jake Carter, went right in his front yard. The kids helped blow up balloons, red ones, blue ones, yellow ones. Mrs. Lopez brought snacks for everyone. Old Man Pete sat on his porch, watching and sipping lemonade. Even some of Karen's HOA friends showed up, curious. They didn't frown anymore, they smiled. By the next day, the festival was ready. The street filled with music and laughter. People came from all over Meadow Hills and even farther to see it. There were tables with paints and brushes for kids to make their own art. A band played fun songs, and food trucks sold hot dogs and ice cream. Jake's red fence stood tall, the centerpiece of it all. People took pictures in front of it, saying, "This is so cool." The newspapers wrote about it, calling it the red fence that changed everything. Jake walked around, shaking hands, grinning at everyone. "Glad you like it," he'd say. Karen didn't come out much after that. She stayed inside, peeking through her curtains sometimes. She saw the crowds, heard the music, and watched Jake get all the cheers. Her clipboard sat on her table, collecting dust. She didn't try to stop the festival, she couldn't. The city loved it, the neighbors loved it, and her rules didn't matter anymore. She'd lost, and Jake had won. Big time. The guy everyone underestimated? He'd outsmarted them all. At first, they thought he was just some dude with a paint can, breaking rules for no reason. Karen called him a troublemaker. Tom yelled at him. Even the nice neighbors like Mrs. Lopez didn't know what he was up to. But Jake had a plan all along. That red fence wasn't just paint, it was a surprise, a gift, a way to make Meadow Hills fun again. He didn't fight with loud words or mean tricks. He just painted, waited, and let the truth come out. And when it did, everyone saw who he really was. The festival lasted all weekend, and it was a hit. People danced, ate, and made art together. The kids painted little fences on paper, copying Jake's red one. Old Man Pete said it was the best thing to happen in years. Mrs. Lopez told Jake, "You're amazing." Even Tom stopped grumbling and ate a hot dog by the fence. Jake's name was everywhere, on signs, in chats, in smiles. The guy they'd laughed at was now the guy they cheered for. When it was over, the decorations came down, but the red fence stayed. It stood there, bright and bold, a reminder of what Jake did. People didn't call him a troublemaker anymore. They called him the art guy or the festival hero. Meadow Hills felt different now, happier, louder, more alive. And it was all thanks to Jake, the guy with a brush, a secret, and a big win. Karen. She learned to be quieter after that. She still had her rule book, but she didn't wave it around so much. The HOA didn't boss people as hard anymore. Jake had shown them that rules aren't everything sometimes, a little color and fun matter more. And that red fence? It became the talk of the town, a story kids would tell for years. Justice was served, not with yelling or fighting, but with paint and a smile. Jake proved he was right, and Meadow Hills would never forget it. Okay, everyone, we've made it to the end of Jake's wild story. That red fence, those HOA cops, Karen's big frown, it all turned into something amazing, didn't it? Now, let's sit back for a minute and think about what happened. There's a big lesson hiding in this tale, and it's one that can make us smile, cheer, and maybe even feel a little braver ourselves. So, what's the lesson here? Let's figure it out together, step by step, with some fun and easy words. First, picture Jake at the start. He was just a regular guy with a pickup truck and a rusty toolbox. He didn't look special. He didn't act loud or bossy. The neighbors saw him mowing his lawn or waving hello, and they thought, oh, that's just Jake. Some people like Karen picked on him. They called him a troublemaker. They laughed when he grabbed that can of red paint and started brushing it on his fence. He's breaking the rules, they said. He's going to get in big trouble. Even Grumpy Tom yelled at him to stop. Everyone thought Jake was small, silly, maybe even a little dumb. But guess what? They were so wrong. Jake didn't just paint a fence, he painted a victory. That's the big surprise. He wasn't messing around or being naughty for no reason. Nope, he had a secret up his sleeve, something huge and awesome. While Karen was yelling and the neighbors were whispering, Jake stayed quiet and kept working. He didn't fight back with mean words. He didn't cry or give up. He just painted, slow and steady, with a little grin on his face. And when the time was right, boom, he showed everyone the truth. That red fence wasn't trouble. It was the start of the Meadow Hills Art Festival, a big, fun party for the whole town. Jake wasn't small or silly. He was smart, sneaky, and super cool. So, here's the first part of the lesson: sometimes, the person everyone picks on is the one with the biggest surprise. Think about it. Jake didn't look like a hero at first. He didn't have a cape or a fancy car. He was the underdog, the guy nobody thought could win. Karen and the HOA thought they had all the power with their rulebook and their HOA cops. They picked on Jake because he didn't follow their boring beige and white rules. But Jake had something better than rules. He had a plan. He had a dream. And he made it come true, right in front of everyone's eyes. That's what makes this story so great. The little guy, the one they laughed at, turned out to be the strongest of all. Now, let's think about Karen and the people who thought they were in charge. Karen strutted around Meadow Hills like she owned it. She loved her clipboard and her thick rulebook. She told everyone what to do, how tall their grass could be, what color their fences had to be. Beige or white, she'd bark. That's the rule. She thought she was the boss, the big winner. When Jake started painting his fence red, she got mad. I'll stop him, she said. I'll call the cops. She was so sure she'd win. And for a while, it looked like she might. The neighbors watched, the HOA cops showed up, and Karen stood there smirking, arms crossed, ready to see Jake lose. But then surprise. Jake didn't lose. He won. Big time. When he opened his garage and showed that giant sign, Meadow Hills Art Festival sponsored by Jake Carter, Karen's smirk fell off her face. Her jaw dropped. The HOA cops ran away. The neighbors cheered. Karen didn't look like the boss anymore. She looked silly. She tried to argue, waving her rulebook, but nobody cared. She slunk back to her house, quiet and small, while Jake stood tall. That's the second part of the lesson: those who think they're in charge might just be the ones left looking silly. Karen thought she had all the power, but Jake showed her that power isn't about rules or yelling, it's about doing something brave and awesome. Let's talk about that for a second. Jake's victory wasn't loud or mean. He didn't shout at Karen or fight the HOA cops with fists. He didn't need to. He used his brain and his paintbrush. He stayed calm, even when people got mad. He kept painting, even when they called him names. And when the time was right, he showed everyone what he could do. That's what makes him a real winner. He didn't just beat Karen, he made something beautiful for Meadow Hills. A festival. Music, balloons, food, art, all because of Jake. He turned a fight into a party. How cool is that? So, what can we learn from Jake? Maybe it's this: don't let people push you down. If someone picks on you or says you can't do something, don't give up. Keep going, like Jake did with his paintbrush. Maybe you've got a surprise up your sleeve too, a talent, an idea, a dream. It doesn't matter if people laugh or call you silly. Keep working, keep smiling, and when the time's right, show them what you've got. You might not have a red fence or a festival, but you've got something special. Everyone does. Jake proved that. And what about the Karens out there? The ones who think they're the boss? Well, they might learn something too. Being loud and bossy doesn't always win. Rules are okay, but sometimes, letting people be free and happy is better. Karen wanted everything perfect: beige fences, short grass, no fun. But Jake's red fence brought color and joy to Meadow Hills. It made people laugh and dance. Maybe the Karens of the world can see that being kind and open is stronger than being strict and mean. Maybe they'll put down their clipboards and join the party next time. Let's imagine you're in a story like Jake's. Maybe someone at school says you can't do something. That's dumb, they laugh. You'll never win. Or maybe a grown-up tells you there's only one way to do things their way. What would Jake do? He'd keep going. He'd smile, nod, and work on his plan anyway. He'd show them, not with yelling, but with action. You can do that too. Be the underdog who surprises everyone. Paint your own red fence, whatever that means for you. Maybe it's drawing a picture, building something cool, or helping a friend. You don't need to be loud or big. You just need to be you. This story's about more than a fence. It's about being brave. It's about turning a bad day into a good one. Jake didn't just win, he made Meadow Hills better. He took all that tension, all that yelling, and turned it into something fun. That's real power. Not the power to boss people around, but the power to make them happy. And the best part? Anyone can do it. You don't need a pickup truck or a paint can. You just need a little spark, like Jake had, and the guts to keep going. So, what do you think? Did Jake get the last laugh? I say yes. He outsmarted Karen, tricked the HOA, and made everyone cheer. He's the hero of this tale, no doubt about it. Tell me in the comments, what do you think about Jake's big win? Did he surprise you? Did you cheer when he opened that garage? I want to hear all about it. And while you're at it, tell me this: what's your red fence? What's that one thing you'd do to surprise everyone? Drop it down below. I'm excited to read your ideas. Thanks for sticking with me to the end, friends. This story was a blast, wasn't it? If you liked it, if you laughed, gasped, or clapped for Jake, give it a big thumbs up. It helps me know you had fun. And if you love stories where the underdog wins, hit that subscribe button right now. I've got more tales like this coming your way, stories about regular people doing amazing things. You won't want to miss them. See you next time, and keep being awesome, just like Jake. Bye for now.